Welcome back, everyone. This is episode 5 of my series of conversations about the Berry Dunn National Healthcare at Home Best Practices Study. My series has featured lead researcher Lindsay Doak, and today we are joined by co-chair of the study, Keith Crownover. Most of you are familiar with Keith. He is the co-chair of the study and has been Lindsay's technology advisor. So, as you might guess, technology is the topic of episode 5. Lindsay, Keith, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
So, I want to start off by kind of setting the stage. We are we have been talking about practices for hospice, home health. We've been talking about hiring, staff shortages, nursing shortages, and what the study has found, what the information from the data has found to help all of you agency personnel to make adjustments to find out what the top performers are doing, in particular as it impacts your PDGM revenue. So I think that's going to be the focus this morning. Who wants to start? Keith, have you been working with Lindsay to analyze the data?
Well, Lindsay is the analytical expert, so I'm happy to help in any way I can, and certainly I find it intriguing with my long history in this space of seeing how adoption of technology does and does not impact the results. Certainly, I have my biases and views, but to me, the data revealed pretty much what I was expecting to see. In some ways, there are disappointments, but Lindsay's the analytical expert. And I'm just, like many of you, interested in the results and trying to follow along and understand and analyze as best I'm able.
Lindsay, this is a broad topic, and we only have
Very
our
well.
usual 20 minutes or so. So I'm assuming that you have been looking at home health agencies who use electronic health records, who use uh, telehealth in various formats. So you choose. Where would you like to start? What's the most impressive finding that you've
Most
noticed so
impressive.
far?
Maybe we start at the beginning. The difficulty with a technology survey is that we can survey organizations and they can say, yes, they have X, Y, and Z, but we can't get to the bottom of how well they're implementing X, Y, and Z through a survey. So, it's difficult when you're looking at the data and you want to find, okay, does telehealth result in higher quality? Does telehealth result in higher patient satisfaction or higher revenue? And obviously, when we talk about technology, most of what the input survey had requested was information on telehealth. So we really wanted to get to the bottom of what was going on with telehealth. The good news is 92% of respondents say that they've used telehealth in some capacity. So we're seeing a significant, obviously due to COVID, the majority of those organizations have adopted telehealth within the past 3 years. What we didn't see as a result of the study is some definitive outcome from using telehealth. We didn't see, it's difficult because when you have 92% of organizations that say they use telehealth, your N for people that said they don't use telehealth is so small that you don't really have a good comparison there to go by. So there's pros and cons to that, but we're looking at quality outcomes and patient satisfaction and revenue PGGM surplus, and there really wasn't any direct correlation that we could pull from the users of telehealth on impact on quality and patient satisfaction and revenue. So I don't know, Keith, if you have thoughts on that and insights on telehealth and how it's being used. And obviously there's organizations I think that are very successful with telehealth. I've talked to some that have seen impacts. It's just not in the data that we're seeing.
What would be interesting, I don't believe this is in the data either, would be to look at not only those who say they're using telehealth, which 92% is quite strong and stronger than I would have expected. Makes sense that COVID was the driver for that adoption. But how does that 92% adopt telehealth? What is it they're using the telehealth for? What percentage of their caseload are they applying the telehealth to? And what disease states, using an old terminology, what comorbidities exist, so we could track where's telehealth being applied. This is where the value of the study we expect is in the ongoing details as we go deeper and deeper. So that would be a question I'd love to know. 92% use telehealth, and I'm sure the variance in how they use telehealth is quite broad. So um, we know the effectiveness of telehealth, but it's very effective when it's very targeted. So again, I think this is an area, as they would say in academia, for future study, where it would be very interesting to me to say, let's break this down, especially given the high adoption rate, and say, what are the variances in how the technology is adopted?
Well,
Yeah.
it occurs to me that asking someone if they use telehealth is a lot like asking someone if they eat food. There are so many nuances underneath the title. There's passive remote patient monitoring, there's vital sign monitoring, and there's patient engagement tools. Some patients who are willing and capable of using a tablet, and some who are not, some who have family living with them. It would seem that all of that detail is probably deserving of its own study.
Yeah,
Even
yeah.
teleconsultation
Mhm.
between caregivers. Some would call, I'm sorry, Lindsay, but even teleconsulting between caregivers, some would qualify that as telehealth. So that gets into one of the interesting aspects, sometimes frustrating, is we're trying to gather data. We are gathering data in such a broad, deep process. And what is the definition for the use of telehealth? So you're right, Tim. There's all kinds of variances in how telehealth's adopted.
Yeah, and we knew this going in, as we talked about in earlier sessions, Tim. We have 144 questions on this survey, which included everything. And we really tried to cover best practices, palliative care, staffing, future insights, technology. So we knew going into this that probably what's needed is a much more robust, follow-up, probably some qualitative research on telehealth specifically, but technology in general. What we did capture, I was able to pull the best practices from the Centers of Excellence. And if you remember from the last session, Centers of Excellence are those with the highest outcomes and highest patient satisfaction, and then PDGM surplus. So how are they using telehealth is kind of the question we asked. And we see that they have mostly adopted it in the past 3 years, which tells me that these organizations are agile. They're not, it's kind of funny because those organizations that said that they've had used telehealth for more than 5 years actually had lower outcomes than those who have newly adopted telehealth, which would tell me perhaps if it's kind of collecting dust in the background. They've been doing it for 5 years and they're not really paying attention to it, versus those who really have newly adopted it and are really focused on it. They have 51 to 75% of their monitors in use at any given time. So the usage is higher. For those with more than 5 years, it's smaller. So again, collecting dust, it's time to bring out those telehealth. If you've been using it for longer than 5 years, it's time to refocus on that. And they focus their telehealth on specific patient populations or patients with chronic conditions versus all patients. So they're really targeting where they're using telehealth for the best bang for their buck. So those were some insights we could get from the study. How they use it. Is there any sort of reduction, rehospitalization? I think we'd have to go back to what Keith said and really focus on the specific chronic conditions, because we know that for certain chronic conditions, telehealth is critical for reducing those hospital visits. So diving into that data and looking at those chronic conditions and then correlating that to telehealth would probably give us some better outcomes. But also, this is something that would require qualitative research and follow up in terms of interviews and questions and discussions on how organizations are using it.
Well, the other obvious question that can only be answered by a researcher is cause and effect. Are these agencies that are using telehealth moving themselves into the top performers, or is it characteristic of a top performer that they are more likely to adopt telehealth?
Yeah, and that's the $1 million question. I mean, it would tell me that, the past 3 years that they're more agile in their thoughts and technology adoption. So that whenever there's something of need, they're adopting it and not resisting it. But you'd have to get into the bottom of, if, chicken and egg, like you said, is it telehealth that's leading the outcomes, or outcomes they're a well-oiled machine and now they recognize that they need to adopt and implement telehealth as part of that?
It reminds me of a story, and I will give you a chance to talk next, Keith. Years ago, I attended a Myers-Briggs workshop and helped to analyze the results. And I pointed out to the leader, there are a lot of people with these two characteristics. I think it might have been N and F. And he said, yes, those are the people who attend workshops. And so did you get a cross section of all telehealth users, or did you kind of are the people who use telehealth the kind of people who would respond to a survey?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I've said that before. I mean, we had, going back to the mix, we did have a good mix. So we had national agencies, small, big, chain, non-chain, but the 92%, our thought is that that's more indicative of those who are advanced and wanting to learn more and wanting best practices are more likely to fill out the survey. So the number is probably lower in terms of a national number. But those organizations that filled out the survey are probably more likely to implement these new technologies. And so you got some of that factor in here as well.
I'm curious about
Lindsay.
dust on the shelf. Keith, in your years and years with Delta, you probably had a number of clients who had tried telehealth, and I've heard stories for a good 20 years about people who try it, and most of these machines are gathering dust on the shelf. Have you had experience personally with that?
Absolutely. And I was thinking in the context of this conversation of the years of experience, when did telehealth really take off in our industry? And I was flipping my memory here a little bit, and it was when NAC was in Seattle, I believe in 2005, that was sort of the zenith of the home ed era. And as I think about telehealth, we saw different technologies, different vendors bringing those technologies to market. We saw the newer technologies displacing the older technology. But oftentimes, especially if you're familiar with some of the business models, and I won't get into that in our conversation this morning, but some of those vendors have very creative ways of getting providers to adopt their technology around a contractual obligation, not necessarily a clinical driven obligation. So yes, we've seen monitors on the shelf in the closet. We've also seen one generation displace the next generation, displace the next generation. So that phenomenon really becomes like any tool, particularly any technology tool. You have to have the want to use it. You have to have the management discipline to implement it and to expect results. And I'm not at all surprised that it's pervasive. Again, the fascinating point is that next layer down. So,
well, that's what occurs to me. You talked about recent adopters. So the impact of COVID on the practice of home health has probably not been analyzed and discussed enough. But when nurses were reluctant to go into homes, and when patients were locking the door and not letting them in, do you think that might have been the driver when this number got up to 92%, and that in itself would explain why the more recent adopters are using it more than the ones that adopted it before COVID?
Yeah, and what we're actually seeing, because CMS just released telehealth usage numbers for the first quarter of 2022, is that the use of telehealth is significantly dropping. So in the height of COVID of second and third quarter of 2020, it was close to 60-70% of patients were using telehealth of some sort. And then within the first quarter of 2022, that's dropped down to the high teens. So we saw significant usage, and now we're seeing it drop, probably because of a lot of things we're talking about. We're also seeing a great divide by the states. So there's states like Connecticut and Massachusetts that have more than 60% of their patient population using some form of telehealth. Medicare Part B population, this is focused on. And then you have states, I think, North Dakota, South Dakota, Mississippi, where it's in the 1-5% that are using telehealth. So there's a massive digital divide, even amongst the states of the United States in terms of where this telehealth is being used. And, Tim, Keith was a part of some of our future research projects, but one of my very first research project was 15 years ago when it was a telehealth study, and we are on the cusp of telehealth. And that was 15 years ago. We thought, okay, this is the time, this is going to take off. And it just never has. And so just trying to figure that out and what that resistance is and what's not working with it, so that, because we know with the clinical shortages and the staffing shortages, we've got to figure something out.
Well, Keith, that goes back to what you said, doesn't it, about the evolving types of technologies. I see today a lot more of video cameras and passive observations of patients living alone, and incidentally including weight scales and blood pressure cuffs that are kind of a commodity these days, where they were the most expensive part of telehealth in the year that you mentioned, '05. Today it's something that's thrown in to a monthly fee where you're able to monitor the patient 24/7 in a variety of ways. So as the technology changes, it looks like the study would change. You'd have to be asking different questions going forward, I would think.
You're right about the what I would describe now as consumer targeted products that are focused more on the patient's living status, their moving, their involvement socially, their activity levels, more targeted to the consumers themselves. There are a lot of these platforms out there right now. So again, if we telescope back out, during COVID, we had very much, it was about presence and just making that connection and making sure we were understanding where patients were in the most emergent situations. As the emergency waned, what's happened is the technology has advanced. Now it's very consumer based, and it's more about how's my mother doing. Let me make sure she's connected. Let me make sure she's reading her New York Times online or whatever it is she's doing. And oh, by the way, we're capturing these health indices as well, health data points. So again, the evolution continues. And the interesting aspect is, how do those most successful providers adopt the technology? And I suspect those who have a strategy and a targeted tactical plan of saying, this is how we're going to use telehealth technology to improve outcomes, who would have the best results, as we would expect. What gets measured improves. So yeah, it's a story unto itself, Tim, in terms of how the technology has evolved and the usage has evolved.
And I know it might have been beyond the scope of this particular study, but it seems as though that would be an argument for these patient engagement systems, passive patient monitoring systems that are replacing the old tabletop vital sign monitoring systems, to be used more in private duty and paid for by the family than in home health, where reimbursement could be another generation away for all we know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even thinking of my own dad, I just gave him an Apple Watch and we're calling it a day. I can call him, we can monitor his heart rate, do all of those things. So it has to be as simple as that. And then if that could be in some way connected to sharing that data with me, I think that's what the future of this technology is.
Well, that might be the next project for you. The ones who have been pitching me, asking for space in my newsletter to talk about their technology, tend to be tabletop, tablet type companions So the voice will come on and tell you when it's time to take the blue pill. It will remind you to drink water, tell you when it's lunchtime, who is coming over to pick you up for the doctor appointment. And you have to actually touch the screen or even talk to it to say, yeah, I did that. Go on to the next reminder. I've been seeing a number of companies with that type of technology, and that's so different from the days when, Keith, you said that home ed was breaking ground and putting vital sign monitors on everybody's desk. And these tablets can also then be used as a video conferencing with family, friends, physicians, pharmacists, whoever you want to include in the conversation. It seems to me that that's the direction that we're going right now. Either
Yeah,
of
I
you
agree.
see
If
those kinds of things?
Yeah, in that same era, Tim, I happened to mention that NAC that year was in Seattle. We took a field trip as a NAC board. At the time, I was on the NAC board to a Microsoft Smart Home, 2005, 17 years ago. 17 years ago, we had all the technology we're talking about. 3D printing was kind of new and cool, but the home data capture was really pretty unexciting, pretty basic blocking and tackling. We're still not yet fulfilling that dream. But as technology becomes more pervasive in the background and the daily fiber of everyone's life, the question then becomes, how do we as an industry and as technologists tap into that data that the client, client's family themselves are paying for? And it was said at that time, a quote I've always remembered is, the problem isn't not enough data. The problem is finding context and providing context, turning the data into operational information. So in Lindsay's example with her dad, what happens if his heart rate becomes erratic using that Apple Watch? So how do we take the data, which again is getting more and more prevalent, and how do we make it actionable? And that's ultimately the challenge that we're going to always be facing. Access to the data will be less and less of an issue. It really becomes, how do we put it into practical use?
Absolutely. And I don't think we can underestimate the impact of the social determinants of health on a patient's health. I think a lot of times when we think of telehealth, we're thinking of, like you said, Tim, monitoring the vital signs. But there's actually been research in Japan that shows if you give the senior citizens there an iPad so that they can communicate with their family, that it reduces their depression and reduces their risk of rehospitalization. Loneliness, isolation, depression from being isolated as a senior, being connected through technology, which most of them have resisted, but there's a use for it, can impact their satisfaction, their outcomes, their rehospitalization rate. So I would love to see a study like that in the United States, where we're using it not just for the physical health, but also the mental health of the patient, and implementing it in that way.
That can't be underestimated. I have talked to a number of people about moving technology in the direction of the social determinants of health and dealing with loneliness. Just one quick story. Years ago, I talked to a technology company that had a medication dispenser, and it was connected so that you could detect when the medication was, well, at least removed. You couldn't tell if it was solid, but it removed from the case. And it included an emergency button to make a phone call to the technology company directly, or it could be adjusted to go to the home health company. They had to turn it off and make it so that they could call the patient, because they were constantly getting loneliness calls. Hi, how are you? What are you doing today? And so they had to stop these lonely people from bothering them. But something else needs to be done with technology to accommodate that gap, to deal with loneliness. And systems like the one we're using today seem to be becoming more and more prevalent, especially so they can talk to family, they can talk to nurses. I've even seen VR being used. You see these octogenarians with the goggles on and participating remotely in grandson's birthday party.
Yeah, and that could be the future of what we're looking at here. Obviously vital signs are important, but that that same technology could have a significant and low cost impact on those mental health components. And so imagine if that company had somebody on the other end that just listened, and the impact on that patient's health. So seeing it go in that direction, and obviously with Oasis, now we have social determinants of health that we're monitoring. You could take the results of that Oasis assessment and then determine if they need something like this, and then implement it in the home, and then see if that has an impact on rehospitalization scores, which is big for value-based purchasing. So I feel like a lot of the organizations are really in the weeds right now, because there's a lot going on to really think about that, but the impact of that could be significant.
So I'm going to finish by putting you on the spot in the next 2.5 minutes. What recommendations can each of you make in the technology arena with regard to best practices? Talk to me about the findings of the study. Talk to me about your personal opinions. But what are your strongest recommendations for technology that we can leave people with today? Either one of you can go
I'll go
first.
first, Keith, and then I'll let the meeting end with the GOAT of technology. So for me, looking at the results of the study, it's that AI machine learning automation for any area that you can do it. So for home health, the centers of excellence had a tendency to do it with the rev cycle phase. And for hospice, they did it with intake. And if you take a look at other industries, I went to a restaurant, I ordered online, I ordered with my phone, and then the food came out, no difference in my satisfaction levels. I got my food, that was great. We have to, with the staffing crisis that we're undergoing right now, we have to find ways to use technology that doesn't impact the patient satisfaction, the quality. And what we're seeing is if you replace the clinicians, then the patients aren't as happy. But all of those non-clinical duties, we've got to figure out a way of streamlining and using less human power for those, because that's the only way we're going to be able to manage the staffing crisis. We're not going to be able to fill every seat of the organization with people. And so really taking a look at what can be streamlined through technology or even replaced with technology solutions, and implementing those in organizations.
Keith, we all know that GOAT means greatest of all time, not anything derogatory. So how about if you give us your perspective?
Well, it might be I have to figure out the acronym, the oldest of all time. So my perspective would be, and as someone who has spent, as I know you both have as well, a long part of my life in this industry, I often find it fascinating what hasn't changed and what is unlikely to change. And we didn't talk about anything radical in terms of new technology on this call. We didn't uncover anything in the study that was radically new and different. So it comes down to the reality is no matter how advanced the technology gets, we all crave the human touch. And no matter how ill I might be, no matter who's paying for my care, we all crave the human touch. What Lindsay says is absolutely true. We're being asked always, constantly to do more with less, to achieve more with less. So the technology isn't necessarily the key. Technology will continue to evolve and advance, and we as an industry get to take advantage of more and more technologies in the surrounding industries that are available to us all. We live in a wonderful age, in my view. So the human touch need's not going to go away. That social interaction is key to anyone's thriving. So it comes down to me, the number one attribute I would be looking for in the adoption of technology is a management team that is focused on intelligently applying technology. And this hasn't changed either. This has been consistent for my entire 30, 40-year career. How can we use technology, whatever technology that is, to move the needle in terms of quality of outcomes, both clinically and financially? And it's about the organization who spends enough time just taking that discussion seriously, establishing objectives for their organization, and being disciplined enough to execute it. I recently did a site visit, quick side story, with an organization that's still using manual plastic mail bins to track their patients through the admission process. As a technologist, I looked at that and said, what? This is 1970 stuff. You know what? It works for them. It works very well for them. They're very disciplined about that. So to me, there's no secrets. The secret has long been known. It's about execution and intelligent, meaningful, targeted execution to say, what about my care? What about my agency's financial health am I trying to change? What technology exists? Because there's thousands of options now. And am I implementing it in a way that I'm not just doing me too, but I'm focusing this deployment of technology on truly moving the needle and holding our organization accountable. So to me, everything old is new again. And it's really about that management focus and execution.
That's a perfect way to wind up with that kind of advice from both of you. And we are just about out of time. So I want to thank you once again. Lindsay Doak is the lead researcher for Berry Dunn, and Keith is her co-chair, specializing in technology because that's what he knows best. I was about to say the only thing he knows, but that's not true. I know that Keith has a broad, eclectic background. So,
Emphasis on the eclectic.
thank you both very much. This has been exciting. I think we are almost down to the end here with episode 5. Lindsay will do a summary, perhaps, and I will see both of you at the NAC meeting as we record this. It's time for both of us to get on airplanes and make our way to St. Louis, and maybe I can pick your brain a little bit more there. But for our viewers, we'll do one more of these. Episode 6 will be kind of a summary. So Lindsay, you can prepare for that. And I will put on the closing slide here contact information so that you can download, if you like, and read the entire National Healthcare at Home Best Practices Study results as analyzed by lead researcher Lindsay Doak and assisted by co-chair Keith Crownover. Thanks again, both of you, for joining me today.